right, friends. Well, we are back again. Thank you for returning. I don't know if Rebecca's paid any of you to be here to help boost my confidence or what, but I appreciate you returning tonight. So the goal this evening, we're going to kind of, continue with our theme from last week. We started talking about the beginnings of Baptists in England. We're going to kind of continue with that tonight. I told Pastor Anthony the other day, much like my own classes at HLG, I'm late. And so running behind. And so I may need an extra Sunday, but that's okay. So we'll, last week and this week, we'll wrap up English Baptists. We'll not have class next Sunday due to 4th of July. I don't believe there's any Sunday night activities next Sunday. And so, but then the following Sunday, we'll start with early Baptists in America next Sunday, and then Sunday after that. Don't know exactly which one yet, but a Sunday after that, we'll talk about the birth and the rise of the Southern Baptist Convention. So, where we left off. So just as a quick summary, where we left off from last time. So if you remember, we talked about the birth of the Reformation in England, right? So the Reformation, the great kind of breaking away from the Roman homogeny across Europe. The Reformation begins, it kind of has some pre-beginnings in various places, but if we got to kind of put our thumb on a date, of course, begins with Luther in Germany, and then you have other reformations kind of popping up throughout Europe in various different places. The Reformation, though, hits England in a rather kind of different, distinctive sort of way, right? Which leads to the kind of earliest, at least this modern group of Baptists that are most directly connected to us today. So the Reformation, in a sense, the Reformation in England begins as early as Henry VIII. Of course, again, we remember Henry VIII is wanting to separate, not so much to create a full-blown Protestant Reformation within England, but he does want to separate the English church from the power of Rome. He wants to separate the English church from the kind of formal and informal control of the Bishop of Rome, of the Pope, and he essentially wants to be the head of the church in England. And he manages to pull that off during his life and during his reign. And so when Henry dies, his son, Edward VI, becomes king. Edward's pretty young at that point, but Edward VI and his counselors, particularly during his years of minority, they kind of inject the English Reformation with a giant batch of steroids, and it just super Protestant Reformation kicks into high gear for the few years that Edward VI is king before he dies. He dies about 16 or 17, relatively young. And so you get everything from, of course, going all the way back to Henry VIII, you have monasteries being dissolved, the lands going back to ownership of the crown. During Edward VI, you have the publication of Cranmer's Book on Common Prayer. You have the restriction of a celibate priesthood removed. You have a more Protestant understanding of the Lord's Supper and the church and these sorts of things operating under the English Reformation. It kind of kicks into high gear. You have the removal of much of the sacramental system, though some vestiges still kind of carry around. It's massively in flux, massively changing, with some influence from Luther and the kind of the Lutheran branch of the Reformation, but probably a majority influence rather from the kind of Reformed branch of the Reformation. If you remember those three branches that we talked about, kind of our first meeting. Edward dies. His sister, Henry's other child, Henry's oldest child really, Mary, becomes queen. And Mary is, much like her mother, very incredibly, massively Catholic. And she swings the pendulum in the complete other direction, so much so that Protestants are rounded up and executed or exiled. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury Cranmer is burned at the stake in the middle of the courtyard in Oxford. Eventually, Mary too, though, dies, and we get to Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth, if you remember, she institutes kind of an attempt at a via media, right? A third way between Catholicism and the rest of the Protestant Reformation. She wants something unique, and it's not just her and those around her, but they want something unique within England, essentially to try to bind the nation together, right? The nation had just been pendulum swinging back and forth several times with lots of blood and rebellion and just general craziness over the last two monarchies over the last several years. And so Elizabeth wants to establish unity, and so she keeps much of the kind of Protestant theology, but allows to put into place a lot of the, let's say, maybe the vibe or the branding of Roman Catholicism. What I mean by that is you still have this kind of high church feel. You have this very strict, very ordered liturgy. You have priests, pastors still being called priests. They're wearing kind of the full robes and stoles. You have the incense burning, the processions, all of the kind of the accoutrements, if you will, of Roman Catholicism in many ways, but trying to kind of wed it with the more kind of mainline Protestant theology, right? And one of the ways that Elizabeth and those that come after her seek to enforce on the Church of England a rule of conformity, okay? So conformity essentially says the crown is going to tell the church how individual churches are to worship. And this is everything from the songs that you sing on Sunday morning to the text that the pastor preaches on Sunday morning to what the priesthood wears, the offices in the church, the holidays that you celebrate, the whole 9 yards, right? In a sense, some of that is kind of written by the Archbishop of Canterbury particularly, but the bishops of the church, but it's enforced by the crown. So in other words, if you're part of a Church of England congregation during, the late 16th century, early 17th century, if you're part of a Church of England congregation and your pastor, your priest, kind of goes off the deep end and he stops wearing a stole, the long things that go over the robe, and he switches from a white robe to a black robe, they could put him in jail. Or if he doesn't preach the text as prescribed by the Book of Common Prayer and the other kind of liturgical apparatus for that particular week, he could be fined, removed from position, and that's actually enforced by the crown. Does that make sense? So you have a literal wed between, which this was normal at this point, between church and state, right? The authorities of the church kind of construct the particulars, and everything is enforced by the crown, which equals kind of this Church of England conformity. So, as Elizabeth comes in, and as well with her heir, James I, it's not her son, but a distant nephew, as these future kings come into play, this conformity becomes challenged. So as the crown begins to push on the Church of England, out comes these non-conforming, or sometimes you'll hear them called dissenting groups, okay? And there's a lot of different ones, but very broadly, we can kind of put them into two categories. You have, and again, this is reviewing from last week, you have separatists and Puritans. Separatists wanted to break away from the Church of England. They saw the Church of England as completely apostate, completely rejecting the Bible, completely rejecting what God has called the church to be. And so they wanted to completely break away from it. Whereas Puritans, generally speaking, at least at the beginning, wanted to stay within the Church of England, but purify, hence the term Puritan. They wanted to purify the church. Okay? Does everybody remember? We're tracking with me so far. So where do Baptists come into this? So the early Baptist congregations typically will form out of one of these two strands, okay? And generally, how they flesh out is that as these separatist congregations or as these Puritan congregations, usually the Rubicon, the kind of the main break comes when they come to an understanding of believers' baptism, right? So when they come to an understanding of believers' baptism, that is often the ultimate, stepping on one side of the fence. Even for those Puritans who were remaining in the Church of England, as they began to adopt believers' baptism and as they begin to adopt, particularly congregationalism, even they break away completely from the Church of England, so that you have almost simultaneously, this is kind of where we ended last time, almost simultaneously, you have these two kind of theologically connected, kind of we compared them to like fraternal twins, right? Theologically connected, right? In other words, they are both hold all of the identifying markers that we would point back and we would look and say, okay, well, what is a Baptist? They would hold these identifying markers, but largely because of the different streams of nonconformity many of these churches are coming out of, they kind of develop some distinguishing characteristics. It's like you have two twin boys, one has red hair, one has black hair, right? So similarly, you have the general Baptists and the particular Baptists. Both are just as Baptist as the other, right? But they do have some distinguishing characteristics. One of the distinguishing characteristics, the reason that they're named General and Particular Baptist, is their view, each group's view of the doctrine of atonement, for instance, right? So for whom did Jesus die, right? So those who held to a general or universal atonement, this is the General Baptist, that Jesus died for everyone, and then those who repent and believe, the work of Christ is then applied to them. And then those who held to a limited or a particular view of atonement, those are the congregations that kind of develop around, and we eventually will label particular Baptists. Now, that's not the only distinction, but that's kind of one of the biggest ones theologically. Other distinctions, again, kind of connections to Puritanism. General Baptists tend to be a little more, again, because they're coming out of this separatist tradition, General Baptists tend to be a little more skeptical, oftentimes, of connections with other theologians and other church bodies, even in England, that aren't similarly Baptist or similarly kind of breakaway nonconformist. Whereas Puritans, while they understand serious defects and deficiencies within these Puritan groups that still maintain infant baptism, that still want to connect to the Church of England, they're able to see a little bit more of a kinship or a connection with kind of those that come before them. Again, I'm kind of painting with a broad brush here, but those are some examples. But in other respects, they're very, very similar, okay? Both General Baptists and Particular Baptists are both confessional, right? And so what I mean by that is they both, very early on in the trajectories of these churches, come together to write and issue public confessions of faith, right? Now, many of them are situational. We'll talk about some of those situations here this morning. But for instance, in 1660, when Charles II becomes king, right? So if you notice here, there's this break called the Commonwealth. Charles I, his complicated, but basically he tries to be a little too much of a king, more in the kind of French European model of I do what I want. And a variety of people had a big issue with that, and eventually he had his head removed from his body. And so there's this in-between period, this decade of the Commonwealth, where Parliament kind of rules directly, and for most of that through a particular individual, Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector. But Cromwell dies, his son's not really up to the job, and so they kind of reestablish the monarchy. And so Charles's son, Charles I's son, Charles II, comes to the throne, and so the General Baptists the General Baptist congregations at the time, not all of them, but many of them, come together, and they write what's called the Standard Confession. This is 1660. They write the Standard Confession and hand deliver it to Charles II, which again, if you remember, is within the tradition of other General Baptists like Helwys, right? Helwys, he writes an early kind of proto-confession writing to, at the time, James I, saying, look, we're good citizens. We're not like these kind of, some of these kind of more crazy radical separatists. And he gets put in jail for his trouble. Similarly, with the Standard Confession, I don't know why I put two F's in there, but with the Standard Confession, they're trying to prove to Charles II that these Baptist congregations that are writing this confession, they are loyal citizens, right? They're not going to be disruptive. They're not going to be disruptive to this restoration monarchy. And they kind of have to do this because one of the things during the Commonwealth is you have this brief kind of period of relative, we'll use this term very, very loosely, relative kind of Protestant religious liberty. Cromwell actually has Baptists, mostly particular Baptists because he's a little more sympathetic with Puritanism, but particular Baptists in general kind of on the side of Parliament, on the side of Cromwell, and so they're involved in Cromwell's government. And so all Baptists are kind of, looked at kind of sideways, like, are you going to start another rebellion? You're sympathetic with this Commonwealth period, with the Parliament rebels. But the General Baptists, they issue the Standard Confession, say, look, in other words, the Standard Confession is to illustrate that they are Christians, right? That they're in line with other believers in England. Yes, they don't want to be part of the Church of England. They don't want to be part of that hierarchy. They have a different understanding fundamentally of what the church is and how one enters into the church and these sorts of things. But they're trying to illustrate to the king that they are, in fact, Christians, right? Similarly, with the Puritans, of course, we talked about this a little bit last time, but you have the first and eventually the Second London Baptist Confession. Both of these confessions are issued publicly. The first London Baptist Confession is 1644. The Second London Baptist Confession is 1670. The first time it's issued is, let me make sure I get this right, 1679. And then it's reissued in 1689. I'll tell you in a minute why. But very early on, you have these particular Baptist congregations coming together and forming confessions of faith, public declarations of what they believe. And these confessions also function as standards by which they will associate. Okay? So here's a second commonality between General Baptist and particular Baptist, even in the early days. Not only were they confessional, but they were also associational. Confessional and associational. From its very earliest days, whether we're talking General Baptist or particular Baptists, they gathered together, fellow churches, under common theology, common doctrine, in order to pool together for encouragement, for accountability, and also for the sake of evangelism and missions, what we would call, evangelism and missions, pooled together resources to be able to accomplish these things. So the earliest Baptist congregations are both confessional and associational. So for instance, with the General Baptists, you can go to it's the General Baptist Assembly. I'm just going to abbreviate this here. But the General Baptist Assembly forms in London in 1653. Now, if you remember, Helwys lands back in England in 1611. So we're talking about 40 years from the first General Baptist congregation. We already have enough General Baptists to come together to form a local association. And they do so that early in their history. Does that make sense? Right? So similarly, we can look at, again, with the Particular Baptists, one of the earliest Particular Baptist congregations. You're looking at what's called the Spilsbury Church in 1640. This is one of the earliest Particular Baptist congregations. By the time we get to 1644, there's multiple churches enough to come together to write a confession that these particular congregations believe this, right? So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that almost right out of the gate, regardless of tradition, regardless of these subgroups of Baptists, whether we're talking General Baptist or Particular Baptists, you have two big common themes, and that's confessionalism and associationalism. And these, I think, are markers of Baptist churches. These should be markers of Baptist churches even to today. So if you want a little kind of modern day application, right? It is well within the Baptist tradition for local Baptist congregations to associate together for common mission. It's a good thing. It's writ into our DNA from our earliest days. As easy and as tempting as it may be sometimes to kind of do it ourselves and pretend like we're the only church that exists and try to do everything independently, the reality is that at hardly any point within the history of Baptists has this been normal. You've got a few spots here and there where independency is a little more valued. There's a little bit more suspicion with associationalism. But to some degree or another, associationalism has been fairly universal within the history of Baptist churches in England and also in America. And second, again, confessionalism. From the very beginning, Baptist churches, when gathered together, have issued confessions. And oftentimes, especially when we get to America, but even in England, oftentimes the purpose of those confessions is not only an external communication of what we believe, but they're also used for internal accountability. Does that make sense? So this is part of kind of some of the discussions going on within the Southern Baptist Convention, even to today, is to what degree is the Baptist faith and message applicable to the convention as a whole, right? So we believe in local church autonomy. The SBC can't tell our church what to believe, but to associate with the SBC, to associate with our National Association of Churches, do we have to conform to certain theological standards, right? And I would argue, despite what some would say, that along with associationalism, this confessionalism is ingrained into Baptist DNA from the very beginning, okay? So, by the time we get to after the Commonwealth, when we get to the Restoration period, so the Restoration period is mostly the reign of Charles II, though technically still the reign of James II. By the time we get to the Restoration period, Baptist congregations have grown. Both General and Particular Baptists have grown, not just in and around London, but throughout England, and even beyond in some cases. You have some of the earliest Baptist congregations in Wales and Ireland, even into Scotland, still kind of in the Anglosphere at this point. But you have a phenomenal growth of Baptist congregations both within within both of these strains. So, for instance, we have probably by the time the issuance of the Second London Baptist Confession, so by 1679, 1689, again, these are very rough numbers. It's hard to tell because it's not like someone was going around counting them, especially considering at this point, technically speaking, being a Baptist is still illegal in a lot of ways, right? But you have as many as over 100 particular Baptist congregations. For general Baptists, I've seen numbers as low as 150 to 200. Some of you even going as high as 300. And so, by the time we get to 1660, so by the time we get to the Restoration and Charles II, several different Baptist historians kind of ballpark anywhere from 300 to 400 what we would kind of mark as Baptist congregations in England. That's both general and particular Baptists. Okay? So, let's say from 1611 then, just to give you a frame of reference, right? From 1611 to 1660, we've gone basically from 1, right, to 300 to 400 congregations primarily within England. Does that make sense? Just to kind of show you kind of the rate of growth there. Sharing these common characteristics of associationalism and confessionalism. And so a significant event happens, though, a significant external event in English history that impacts really not just Baptists, but all Protestant religions, particularly within the Anglosphere. 1689. So 1689, you had this event called the Glorious Revolution, and I'll try not to go onto an English history bonanza like I did last week. But essentially, what happens is Charles II dies, James II becomes king, and people had always kind of suspected Charles II was a little too Catholic friendly. Remember, like we'd just gone through this whole, big division and separation over Protestantism versus Roman Catholicism. Elizabeth institutes her Via Media. Charles II was kind of suspected of being sympathetic, maybe even potentially being a secret Roman Catholic. And this was not just a personal issue. This was actually seen as a state issue. Because at this point, kind of late 17th century, early 18th century, if you know anything about kind of the history of England at this point, who are England's biggest enemies? Well, who's always England's biggest enemy? You got France, right? And then Spain has always kind of been a problem, particularly in this area too. What's the common factor between those two? Roman Catholicism, right? They're dominated by Roman Catholicism. And so it's not just like who cares what religion the king is? Everybody cares what religion the king is, particularly when your kind of national arch enemies are on the other side. So Charles II was seen as kind of this, he's a little suspicious, maybe he's like a secret Catholic, these sorts of things. Well, James is not a secret Roman Catholic. He's a Roman Catholic. He's open out loud in his Roman Catholicism. They kind of say, maybe it'll be okay because he marries kind of a German Protestant princess, but James eventually has a child, male heir. He's even more kind of openly Roman Catholic, and so the concern is that we're going to have another counter-reformation in England, and even more people are going to die. And by this point, we've had the Reformation in England for a long time by this point. So essentially what Parliament does, rather than cutting off James II's head, so they've evolved a little bit, rather than cutting off of his head, they essentially write a letter to William of Orange. William of Orange is essentially a Dutch nobleman who had married an English princess, an English royalty. And they basically, Parliament writes him a letter and says, hey, William, would you like to be king? And I mean, I'm simplifying this a bit, right? And so William is invited to become king of England. He agrees, and James II kind of goes into exile, eventually never to return. He becomes a problem a little bit later. But William III becomes king. Now, William, again, is Dutch. Dutch, remember, kind of Amsterdam, that area. And so he has a tradition. He's grown up in a Protestant tradition with a little more flexibility concerning what we would kind of call religious liberty. So one of the first things that happens, and this is called the Glorious Revolution, when William, it's glorious because not really hardly anybody dies. But when William III becomes king, almost immediately, one of the first acts of Parliament is that they pass the Act of Toleration. The Act of Toleration. So essentially, 1689, the Act of Toleration is passed, and essentially what this means is that nearly all Protestant dissenting groups now have the freedom of worship. Now, it's not just Baptists, but that includes Baptists. So 1689, basically, Baptists are tolerated. Now, there are still limitations, like Baptists can't go to college at this point. They can't hold government offices, these sorts of things, right? But no one's going to like break down their door and put your pastor in jail, right? And so the Act of Toleration is passed. Part of the Act of Toleration, here's a quote from it. It says, to unite their majesties' Protestant subjects in interest and affection. So notice the emphasis there on Protestant subjects. So who's left out? The Roman Catholics, right? So the Roman Catholics in England never really go away. Like they're there, but they also are underground, but they're not allowed to come out due to this. In fact, it actually kind of gets worse for Roman Catholics after this. Another law is passed in 1689 called it's part of the Bill of Rights of 1689. And basically, Parliament at that point, to make sure that this doesn't happen again, Parliament passes a law called Bill of Rights of 1689, where no future monarch of England can be Catholic. And that actually is in effect to even today. So technically speaking, if you are Roman Catholic and in the line of succession, that's different, succession, then you're not qualified by law to become king or queen of England. Random side note. So the situation we have here is that at the dawn of the 18th century, so early 1700s, Baptists in England have unprecedented freedom and the ability for evangelistic growth. So in many ways, we should say that the beginning of the 1700s should be the beginning of kind of like a golden age for Baptists in England. Right? Now they're no longer persecuted, they're no longer restrained by this push for conformity, right? They're able to operate freely, still some constraints, but operate relatively freely with England. By the end of the 18th century, so by the end of the 1700s, Baptists are but a shadow of what they were in the beginning. Their numbers significantly reduced, both particular and general Baptists functionally hollowed out, numerically, but also in vigor of evangelism and growth within England, except with a couple of exceptions that by God's grace he's able to maintain these two traditions in England. So why is that? So I want to kind of try to spend the rest of my time talking about the decline of Baptists in the 1700s, in the 18th century. So what happens, right? So beginning of the 1700s, Baptists are, through the Act of Toleration, they can now worship, they can start new churches, they can grow, they can do so openly in public. They even had it even kind of left over from the Commonwealth area, Baptists have a little more respectability. They're not able to fully participate in government, but as we get deeper into the 1700s, more and more kind of opportunities come up. You have more and more Baptists that are either informally or formally educated, and they kind of come to a Baptist understanding after having been through university, so they're able to kind of be the best of both worlds. But rather than this golden age, you have both of these traditions declining. So why? Well, we're going to deal with these separately, because I would say that while general and particular Baptists decline for two different reasons, the root problem is the same. And the root problem is responding to modernity. So modernity, without going again into philosophical bonanza, essentially what happens is we get into the 1700s is when we get the French Enlightenment. We get a lot of new kind of philosophical and epistemological ideas from the continent begin to develop, where reason, like human reason, begins to overshadow biblical truth as an ultimate source of authority. So when we think theological things, like where does our authority come from, right? Some people are going to say Scripture. Some people are going to say human reason. Some people are going to say tradition. Some people are going to say personal experience, right? And to some degree or another, all of those are accurate. Like we draw from all four of those wells to a greater or lesser degree. But at the end of the day, who wins? Right? So this is part of the issue in the Reformation, right? So tradition, right? Roman enforced tradition was saying things the opposite of what the Bible said. So in their case, tradition won. But part of the Reformation, right, is that no, Scripture should win. But just like most things, right, things drift off. And part of what happens due to continental influences in the Enlightenment is that more and more you have Christian theologians are convinced that if human reason, usually philosophical reason, but if human reason and Scripture, if there's a conflict, then reason wins. Human reason wins rather than kind of the plain understanding of Scripture, right? And this happens not just amongst Baptists, but it happens across the board. It happens almost in every nook and cranny of the kind of European Christian experience, but it hits Baptists in kind of two different ways. Okay, so first, let's deal with the particular Baptists. So the particular Baptists, if you had to name a reason that they decline, the particular Baptists decline due to the influence of what we typically call hyper-Calvinism. Hyper-Calvinism. So what does that mean? So particular Baptists have always had, again, they believe in particular atonement. They're more comfortable with the kind of Reformed branch of the Reformation, and they draw from that well a little more fully than, let's say, the general Baptists do. And so part of that is they are as influenced as we get into the 1700s. They're influenced by some of the trajectories that Reformed theology takes as it hits this Enlightenment philosophy on the continent, and they take God, the understanding of God's sovereignty in salvation, and they untether it from the Bible. It's probably the best way for me that I can think of to explain what they do, right? So they take God's sovereignty in salvation, God's control, His sovereignty of election, predestination, but then they philosophically unhook it from the Bible and just let it go. And the way it just kind of goes is eventually you get to the point where Reformed theologians, both in the kind of European Reformed set, but also within Anglicanism, within the Church of England, and also amongst some particular Baptists, Reformed theologians eventually get to the point, because reason has kind of taken over, kind of philosophical deduction, and reason has taken over for clear biblical pronouncement, and has said, look, if God is truly sovereign over election, then what's the point of evangelism? What's the point of missions? There is no point. God's going to save whom he saves, so we should just sit back and sit in our churches and do our things and let everybody else kind of go about their business, right? Now, this is often a critique leveled against kind of modern-day Calvinism in some aspects, but in the 18th century, this is actually what was being taught and believed in certain corners, in certain areas, not just amongst Baptists, but in many areas of Christianity. And so what eventually happens is you have this movement amongst particular Baptists to reject the offer of free grace due to this biblically untethered view of God's sovereignty in salvation. So, as one would assume, right, if churches are no longer in the business of the Great Commission, in essence, what this means is they're using this kind of philosophical deduction and booting out the Great Commission, booting out the call to proclaim the gospel. And the Lord is still going to save whom he saves, but the church is still called to proclaim that gospel to the nations. They boot the proclamation part out, and so, shocker, they shrink. And the churches begin to die. And generation after generation, they get smaller and smaller and smaller, until by the time you get to the end of the 1700s, particular Baptist congregations are but a shadow of their former self. Now, in a not so subtle twist of divine irony, the Lord still uses these hyper-Calvinist reprobates, and within that world, he calls out a few individuals that you might have heard of, like Andrew Fuller and William Carey and Adoniram Judson. And these individuals like these are and others, but they give birth to the modern missions movement. So there's a kernel of the true gospel still kind of maintains despite this atmosphere of hyper-Calvinism, and out of that comes the modern missions movement, which takes the gospel to India, to Burma, to China, and beyond, right? So God's not done with the particular Baptists, even though many of them reject the Great Commission and reject God's call to mission. God still maintains this kernel of gospel truth within them, and through the largely dead particular Baptist congregations by the end of the 1700s, gives birth to the modern missions movement. I know it's 6, real briefly, General Baptists. What happens to them? So the General Baptists, they decline. So whereas particular Baptists decline due to hyper-Calvinism, General Baptists decline essentially due to theological compromise. Now, I would say hyper-Calvinism also is a theological compromise, but what I mean particularly is their response, General Baptist response to the Enlightenment, to the deification of reason, is to make Christianity more reasonable. Right? That's what for the sake of the gospel, you hear this sometimes, for the sake of the gospel, the General Baptists wanted to make gospel claims, biblical claims, more reasonable. So they would look at things like Jesus, both fully God and fully man. Well, that doesn't make sense, so let's boot it out and come up with something else. Right? Things like the Trinity, though obviously biblically taught, biblically proclaimed, it's at the very nature of God. Some General Baptist congregations land into non-Trinitarianism. And so eventually, particularly in America, but this kind of starts within England, you get the birth of some kind of proto-Unitarians. You get groups within General Baptists that come to reject the Trinity, reject the divinity of Jesus. They reject original sin. Others become more mystical with an emphasis on kind of direct personal encounter with spirits or with angels and kind of de-emphasize Scripture as revelation. Again, essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to make the gospel, make the Bible more palatable for their world. But they do so by denying the Lord of the gospel, the Christ as he is proclaimed. And honestly, it's that they didn't, General Baptists didn't invent that. Christian heresies all the way going back to the very earliest days. We even see this in the New Testament. The very earliest Christian heresies all kind of form around making the shocking claims of the Bible more palatable to the world around them. Does that make sense? Now again, particular Baptists are functionally guilty of the same thing. They're kind of worried about a different world in some sense. So, two twin errors kind of come into, as a reaction to the Enlightenment, twin errors come into the General Baptist, come into the particular Baptist. Both groups decline. Both groups kind of become shadows of their former selves. They don't cease to exist by the 1700s. Of course, you have famous British Baptists like Charles Spurgeon by the 1800s. Neither of these groups cease to exist, but their influence or impact and their kind of trajectory of growth is stymied and plummets to where, you're kind of hard. It's one of the reasons, like a lot of people, if you go to England today, you have to look pretty hard to find a Baptist congregation. Like, they're there, but it's not as easy as one would think. Versus here in America, like, you can't throw a can of Coke without hitting a Baptist church in some places, right? And one of the reasons for that is this decline. Okay, so I hate to end on a low note, but again, both general and particular Baptists in England, the Lord does preserve, right? So you have, again, the birth of the modern missions movement through the particular Baptists. General Baptists, you continue to have faithful congregations maintain and persevere throughout the 18th and 19th century in England, but at least numerically speaking, many of them are a bit of a shadow of kind of where they were at the beginning of the 1700s. So, on that note, when we come back after 4th of July, we'll pick up with the birth of Baptists in America.